You know, even the ancient world was full of rules, but some of them were so extreme, strange, or harsh that they sound unbelievable to us now. Today I'm going to count down 20 crazy laws from ancient times. Number 20. The Roman law against wearing purple. In ancient Rome, clothing wasn't just a matter of fashion, it was a statement of power, of your rank, and of your privilege. Among the clearest examples of this was the law restricting the use of purple dye. Purple, especially the deep shade known as Tyrian purple, was rare and extremely expensive because it was made from the secretions of sea snails. Well, it took thousands of these little guys to produce even a small quantity of dye, which made purple cloth worth its weight in gold. As a result, purple became associated with royalty and high office, and to preserve its exclusivity, Roman law restricted who could wear it. During the Republic, certain magistrates wore purple-trimmed togas, and generals celebrating a triumph could don a purple robe. Under the emperors, the restrictions became even stricter. By the 1st century CE, only the emperor himself could wear a toga entirely dyed in purple. Violation of this law was not taken lightly. To wear imperial purple without authorization could be considered treason. Several sources described individuals executed or exiled for dressing above their station. These restrictions weren't just about fashion, it was about reinforcing hierarchy. The color became a visual monopoly of power, so much so that the phrase, "to don the purple," later became a metaphor for becoming emperor. This law may strike us as crazy now because it legislated something as personal as clothing, yet in Rome, appearance was inseparable from politics. Allowing others to wear it would blur the distinction between emperor and subject. Today, it's difficult to imagine clothing colors being regulated so severely, but in Rome, purple wasn't just a color, it was a law, a privilege, and a symbol of the empire. Number 19. The Greek law against wearing excessively fancy clothing. Well, in ancient Athens, democracy was still in its infancy in the 6th century BCE. Lawmakers were concerned with both social order and civic equality. One unusual law attributed to Solon, the great reformer of Athens, restricted the wearing of extravagant clothing by women in public, particularly during funerals. This law was part of a broader set of sumptuary laws. These are rules designed to limit displays of wealth in excess. At funerals, Athenian women were forbidden from tearing their clothing dramatically, wailing excessively, or wearing overly ornate garments and jewelry. They were restricted from visiting graves too often, and the goal was to reduce public disorder and prevent aristocratic families from using funerals as displays of their power and status. Solon's law reflected the Athenian concern with equality among citizens and the stability of the city-state. In a society where the elite might try to outshine one another through public spectacles, restrictions on clothing and behavior helped reinforce moderation. The penalties for breaking these laws weren't always severe, but violators could face fines. More importantly, public disapproval acted as an enforcement mechanism. In a society that valued reputation, being seen as extravagant or disruptive could damage your standing. The ideas of legislating things like this wasn't unique to Athens either. Similar sumptuary laws appeared in Rome, where senators and equestrians were restricted in the kinds of fabrics and colors they could wear, and again in medieval and Renaissance Europe, where laws attempted to separate nobles from commoners by dress. For Athenians, though, democracy required not only political participation, but also a bit of social restraint. By limiting how people could dress and act in public, lawmakers tried to keep the wealth from overshadowing civic equality. From a modern perspective, though, these laws seem intrusive and even oppressive, especially in their attempt to control a woman's behavior. But they do reveal how ancient societies connected morality, modesty, and political order, and how leaders like Solon used the law not only to punish crimes, but to shape the culture of his community. Number 18. The Spartan law that banned luxurious currency. Among the many unusual laws of ancient Sparta was its strict regulation of money. Unlike most Greek city-states, which used silver or gold coins, Sparta deliberately banned the circulation of precious metal currency and required its citizens to use bulky iron bars as money instead. This policy, attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, was designed to discourage greed, corruption, and luxury. According to ancient sources like Plutarch, who wrote about Spartan customs centuries later, the iron currency was deliberately made impractical. Iron bars were heated red hot and then quenched in vinegar, a process that rendered the metal brittle and useless for anything else, like tools or weapons. The bars were large and heavy, and a relatively small sum required cumbersome amounts of iron, making it nearly impossible to transport wealth discreetly or even amass a large fortune. The rationale was pretty clear. Sparta's laws aimed to create a society that was focused on military discipline and civic duty, not trade or luxury. By making money inconvenient and worthless outside of Sparta, the law ensured that foreign merchants were less inclined to do business there. The result was an economy that remained relatively simple and austere, reflecting the Spartan ideal of equality among male citizens and the primacy of military service. But this ban on precious metal coinage also tied into some other Spartan restrictions. For example, luxury goods were discouraged, and personal adornments were frowned upon. Meals were taken in common mess halls where men ate simple fare like the infamous black broth. The overall system, called the agoge for the upbringing of Spartan boys, reinforced the idea that individual wealth or comfort mattered way less than collective strength and discipline. To outsiders, these laws seemed bizarre. Other Greeks saw it as extreme, even ridiculous, yet it symbolized what made Sparta different. By deliberately rejecting wealth and making the accumulation of money impractical, Sparta tried to protect itself from corruption and to maintain a society that was centered on equality among the warriors. While in practice, of course, inequality still existed, the elites controlled the land worked by the helots, and the rejection of gold and silver was a powerful symbolic stance. This ban on precious money was less about practical economics than about shaping its culture. It showed how law in ancient societies often sought to mold the citizens' values, even in ways that seemed impractical or extreme. In the case of Sparta, the iron bars of currency were as much a symbol as they were a medium of exchange. Number 17. The Law of the 12 Tables. One really weird law from ancient Rome was the legal authority it granted fathers over their children. According to the Law of the 12 Tables, compiled in the mid-5th century BCE, the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, held nearly absolute power over his offspring, including the right to expose newborns, sell children into slavery, and even in certain cases to execute them. The 12 Tables were Rome's earliest codification of law, inscribed on bronze tablets and displayed publicly so all citizens could know their rights and duties. Among their many provisions were rules governing family life. The authority of the father was central. When a child was born, it was laid at the father's feet, and he decided whether to accept it into the household or order its exposure, abandonment, often leading to death or enslavement. This decision was legally sanctioned, and it reflected the idea that the child's life and status were subject to paternal approval. Fathers retained the legal right to sell their children. While this wasn't commonly done in later periods, the law permitted it, especially in times of hardship. In fact, the 12 Tables specified that if a son was sold 3 times, he would then be freed from his father's authority, an early acknowledgement of the legal limits on paternal power. But maybe most shocking of all aspects of paternal power was the theoretical right to execute a child. Though in practice this was rare and often frowned upon, the legal framework made clear that the father's authority was almost absolute within the household. Roman society placed enormous emphasis on the family as the foundation of the state, and the father was seen as the guardian of both property and morality. Over time, paternal power was softened by custom and later imperial laws. By the classical period of Roman law, fathers no longer exercised these extreme rights without consequences, and children gained more protections. Still, the persistence of these early provisions show how Roman law codified patriarchal authority to a degree that seems extraordinary today. The Law of the 12 Tables was meant to provide fairness by putting rules into writing rather than leaving them to elite interpretation. Yet in the realm of family life, it enshrined a system where one man's authority extended to life and death decisions over his household. To our modern eyes, it's a reminder of how different ancient concepts of family, property, and power could be, and how law often reinforced the dominance of those at the top of the hierarchy. Number 16. The ancient Chinese law that punished entire families. When the Qin dynasty unified China in 221 BCE under Qin Shi Huang, the emperor introduced a harsh legal system known as legalism. Legalism was based on the belief that people could only be controlled through strict laws and severe punishment. Among its most extreme features was the practice of collective punishment, where not only the person guilty of a crime, but also their family and sometimes their neighbors could be punished. One of the most shocking laws required that if someone committed treason or a serious crime, their parents, children, siblings, and even extended family could be executed or enslaved. In some cases, whole communities were implicated. For example, if someone plotted against the emperor and failed, his relatives might be killed alongside him, regardless of whether they had any knowledge of his actions. The logic behind this law was deterrence. The Qin rulers believed that fear was the strongest motivator for obedience. If a man knew that his misdeeds could lead to the death of his children or parents, he would think twice before breaking the law. This approach was intended to root out disloyalty and ensure stability in a newly unified empire that had just emerged from centuries of war. According to some ancient records, it describes cases where families were wiped out under these laws. This severity shocked even later Chinese dynasties, who, while still strict, move away from these extreme collective punishments. Now, while collective punishment does sound crazy to us today, it reflected the priorities of a state that was obsessed with absolute control. The Qin rulers placed the survival of the empire above your individual rights. Justice was less about fairness and more about deterrence and obedience. The law sent a clear message. One person's disloyalty could bring disaster to an entire household. This type of law wasn't unique to China, too. Other ancient societies did practice this collective punishment, though rarely with the same intensity. In ancient Rome, soldiers in a disgraced unit could be subjected to decimation, where 1 in 10 men was executed to discipline the whole. In medieval Europe, families of traitors could lose their lands and titles, but the Qin dynasty stands out for codifying collective punishment so thoroughly in its legal system. Later dynasties tried to balance this law with Confucian ideals of morality and family power, softening the harshness of pure legalism. But the Qin dynasty's legal code, however, illustrates just how extreme ancient laws could be. Number 15. The ancient Egyptian law that barbers could not be priests. In ancient Egypt, religion permeated every aspect of your life, and your priest played a vital role in maintaining a connection between the gods and the people. Priests were bound by strict purity laws that governed what they could eat, what they could wear, and even how they maintained their bodies. Among these rules was a weird law. Men who worked as barbers were forbidden from serving as priests. The reason for this lay in the association between barbers and ritual impurity. Egyptian priests were required to maintain extreme cleanliness. They shaved their entire bodies every few days to prevent lice and ensure ritual purity, and they performed ablutions multiple times daily. But the act of shaving others, the work of a barber, was considered unclean. The barber's contact with hair and bodily dirt was seen as contaminating, making him unsuitable for sacred service. It's striking that barbers themselves were indispensable for maintaining the physical appearance and hygiene of Egyptian society, yet they were marked as unfit for the holiest of roles. This tension between necessity and stigma shows how deeply ancient Egyptians connected everyday work with cosmic order and religious value. Professions were not only ranked by skill or by social class, but by their relationships to purity. By separating those who served the gods from those who dealt with physical impurities, the Egyptians reinforced the sacred character of their temples and rituals. Number 14. The ancient Hebrew law of the Jubilee year. Among the most unusual laws recorded in the Hebrew Bible is the commandment of the Jubilee year, described in the book of Leviticus. According to this law, every 15th year was to be a year of liberation and reset. Land that had been sold was to be returned to its original family owners. Debts were to be forgiven, and Hebrew slaves were to be released. The idea behind the Jubilee was both economic and spiritual. Ancient Israelite society was based on clans and families, with land seen as an inheritance from God that should stay within the lineage. Over time, however, people could fall into debt and be forced to sell their land or even themselves into servitude. The Jubilee law ensured that no family would permanently lose its inheritance. By mandating that land revert to its original owners, the law prevented the accumulation of wealth and property in the hands of a few. This was a radical concept for the ancient world. In most societies, if you lost your land or became enslaved, your descendants inherited that condition. The Jubilee promised a chance at renewal, breaking the cycles of poverty every 50 years. It also reinforced the idea that the land ultimately belonged to God, not to an individual. Scholars do debate whether Jubilee was ever fully practiced as described. Some suggest it was more of an ideal than a law regularly carried out, as there's little direct evidence of its enforcement. Still though, its inclusion in the biblical legal code shows how unusual this concept was. The law envisioned an entire society periodically leveling the playing field, something rare in the ancient world. Maybe we need a little of that now. Number 13. The Draco Laws of Athens. In Athens during the 7th century BCE, the city's first written law code was established by a lawgiver named Draco. These laws are remembered not for their fairness or for their wisdom, but for their extreme severity. So harsh were Draco's punishments that even in antiquity the word Draconian became a synonym for ruthless and unforgiving laws. Draco's code was a response to demands from Athenian citizens for laws to be put in writing so they couldn't be arbitrarily interpreted by the elites. Before Draco, laws were passed down orally, which allowed the powerful to bend them as they pleased. Writing them down gave ordinary people clarity and predictability. However, when Draco produced his code around 621 BCE, Athenians were shocked by the punishments it prescribed. Nearly every crime, whether major or minor, carried the death penalty. Theft of a simple item, like a piece of fruit, could, in theory, result in your execution. According to later accounts, Draco himself explained that the death penalty was appropriate for small crimes because, quote-unquote, they deserved it, and for larger crimes, quote-unquote, there was no greater punishment. The practical effect of Draco's code is unclear. Some historians believe it may not have been enforced literally in all cases, but its reputation stuck. Within a generation, most of Draco's laws were repealed or reformed by Solon, another Athenian lawgiver, who introduced more balanced regulations. But still, Draco's code remained legendary for its severity. Even today, it is endured in the language itself. The adjective draconian is used to describe laws or measures considered excessively harsh. While few legal systems in history could have matched Draco's severity, his laws remain a reminder of how early attempts at codification could swing to extremes. Number 12. The Mesopotamian Law on False Accusations. One striking provision in the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi concerns what happened if someone accused another person of a serious crime but couldn't prove it. The code makes it clear that false accusations were not just embarrassing or dishonorable, they could cost you your life. The law states that if a man brought a charge of murder or sorcery against another and couldn't establish it, the accuser himself was to be executed. In other words, the punishment for a false accusation was the same as if the crime had actually been committed. This was intended to prevent reckless or malicious charges that might disrupt society or damage reputations. This provision also ties into the broader concept of lex talionis, or the law of retaliation, famously expressed in Hammurabi's code as an eye for an eye. The idea was that punishment should mirror the harm caused. A false accuser sought to put another person's life at risk, therefore he risked his own life if the charge failed. From a modern standpoint, this law might seem crazy because of its rigidity, but today, false accusations can result in fines or prison, and they're rarely punished with death. For Hammurabi's lawmakers, however, the logic was clear. A false charge of sorcery, for instance, could have devastating consequences. By threatening accusers with the ultimate penalty, the law aimed to keep these claims in check. Although the harshness of this law is startling, it does show the seriousness with which truth and justice were treated in ancient Mesopotamia. Law wasn't just about resolving disputes, it was about maintaining stability in a fragile society. Number 11. The Roman Law of Decimation for Disobedient Soldiers. One of the harshest military laws of the Roman Republic and later the Empire was the practice known as decimatio, or decimation. This punishment was not aimed at a single individual, but an entire unit of soldiers who showed cowardice, mutiny, or disobedience. The law called for one man in every 10 to be executed, chosen by lot, while the others were forced to watch. The origins of this decimation go back to the early Republic, a time when discipline was crucial for survival. Roman armies often faced enemies with greater numbers, so absolute obedience was essential. If a unit broke formation, abandoned its post, or mutinied, the entire army could be endangered. Decimation was designed to terrorize troops into maintaining order, no matter the cost. When a commander declared decimation, the guilty cohort or legion was assembled. Lots were drawn, and every 10th man was selected. Those chosen were beaten to death by their comrades, often with clubs or stones. The survivors were forced to live with the memory and shame, sometimes on reduced rations or forced to camp outside in the fortified lines. To modern minds, this law seems shockingly brutal, not only because of the executions, but because guilt was collective. A brave soldier could be executed simply because of the failings of his comrades. Yet for the Romans, the priority was collective discipline. Decimation was not common since it risked weakening the army, but it was used often enough to be remembered. Historians record examples during the Republic and early Empire, including under the famous general Crassus in 71 BCE, after his forces faltered against Spartacus's rebel army. Even centuries later, Roman commanders invoked the threat of decimation to keep the troops in line. Number 10. The ancient Indian law of trial by poison. In ancient India, some legal traditions include striking methods of determining guilt or innocence when evidence was lacking. Among the most unusual was a form of trial by ordeal using poison. Some texts describe how a suspect could be tested by being made to swallow a portion of poison or food mixed with poison. If the person survived without harm, they were judged innocent. If they felt ill or died, they were considered guilty. This practice was based on the belief that the gods would protect the innocent. Well, in a society where religion and law were deeply connected, divine judgment was often invoked. The ordeal by poison was one of several such tests. Others included ordeals by fire, by water, or balance. For example, in the fire ordeal, a person might be required to walk across hot plowshares or carry a red-hot iron ball. Survival without injury was seen as proof of truthfulness. The ordeal by poison seems really extreme since the risk was so immediate and lethal. Ancient texts sometimes mention that antidotes or carefully measured doses were used, perhaps reducing the chance of death and leaving room for interpretation. It's also possible that in some cases poison ordeals were symbolic, with less dangerous substances used in practice. From a modern-day perspective, though, this law seems reckless, but in the context of its time, it did provide a dramatic and religiously sanctioned way to settle disputes. The Babylonian river ordeal, where the accused was thrown into a river, is another example. Medieval Europe had ordeals by fire and water, and the Indian ordeal by poison is striking for its reliance on the body itself as the site of divine judgment. But in the survival of these descriptions in legal texts, it shows that they were considered legitimate forms of trial in their day. To us, forcing someone to drink poison to prove their innocence is pretty shocking. To ancient lawmakers, it was a way to let the gods decide. Number 9. The Assyrian law that regulated women's veils. Another unusual and restrictive law in the ancient Near East were the Middle Assyrian laws, the legal code compiled in the 12th century BCE. These laws contained provisions on family, property, and crime, but some of the strictest rules dealt with how women could dress in public, particularly regarding the wearing of veils. The law stated that the wives and daughters of respectable men were required to wear veils when appearing in public. Prostitutes and slave women, however, were forbidden from wearing them. The punishment for breaking this rule was severe. If a prostitute or slave was caught wearing a veil, she could be flogged and have her ears cut off. If a respectable woman went out unveiled, she risked physical punishment and disgrace. But the regulation of veils did serve a clear social purpose. It marked distinctions between women of different classes and statuses. In Assyrian society, clothing wasn't simply a matter of personal choice. It was a signal of one's position and the honor of one's household. By enforcing these rules, the state sought to maintain the visible hierarchy and reinforce social order. What strikes us modern people as crazy is the degree to which the law intruded into personal appearance and imposed mutilation for something as simple as wearing or not wearing a piece of cloth. A veiled woman was identified as belonging to a household under the protection of a man, while an unveiled woman was seen as available for commerce or exploitation. Unlike some later cultures where veiling became more universal, Assyrian law specifically used the veil to draw lines between different social categories. These Middle Assyrian laws as a whole were notorious for their severity, but the veil regulations do stand out as an example of how law could codify social distinctions in a way that might seem arbitrary or extreme today. Number 8. The Egyptian law requiring laborers to work on royal tombs. In ancient Egypt, the construction of royal tombs wasn't just a building project, but a sacred duty. It was tied to the afterlife of the pharaoh. One unusual law required ordinary Egyptians to contribute labor for state building projects, including the tombs, pyramids, and temples. This system was known as corvée labor and meant every able-bodied man could be called upon to leave his field for a set period each year to work on royal monuments. Unlike slavery, this labor wasn't permanent. Farmers and workers would be drafted for weeks or months at a time, especially during the Nile's annual flood when fields couldn't be farmed, and during this period they were expected to haul stones, dig canals, and transport supplies. What made this system unusual was its scale. The Great Pyramid at Giza, for example, required tens of thousands of laborers over decades. These workers were not all slaves, as older theories once suggested, but largely free Egyptians compelled by law to serve. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages shows that they were given food, housing, even medical care during their service. Still though, the work was backbreaking and the obligation was inescapable. From a modern point of view, forcing an entire population to contribute labor for monumental tombs seems a bit extreme, especially since the benefit went primarily to the pharaoh and his afterlife. Building his eternal resting place, though, was seen as ensuring cosmic balance and divine favor. This law reveals how religion, politics, and labor were intertwined in Egypt. Legal obligation wasn't limited to crime or property disputes, it extended to sacred duties that affected the entire community. It also shows how legal systems could formalize mass mobilization, turning a monumental architecture project into a shared national one, whether people wanted to participate or not. Number 7. The Roman law that made firefighting a privately owned service. In ancient Rome, fire was one of the greatest dangers in crowded urban neighborhoods where wooden structures and narrow streets made entire blocks vulnerable. Yet for a time in the early empire, fire protection wasn't a guaranteed public service, but it was tied to law that effectively privatized it. Marcus Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Roman history, famously exploited this system in the 1st century BCE. Rome had no organized municipal fire brigade until the reign of Augustus, and before that, firefighting was left largely to wealthy individuals who formed private crews of slaves trained to combat fire. Crassus, whose fortune was legendary, controlled one of the largest of these private brigades. When a fire broke out, his men would rush to the scene, but they wouldn't start extinguishing the flames immediately. Instead, Crassus would approach the property owner and offer to buy the burning building, often at a fraction of its true value. If the desperate owner agreed, Crassus's brigade would put out the fire. If not, they would let the building burn, ensuring its destruction. Crassus then acquired prime real estate across Rome at bargain prices, adding to his already immense wealth. This practice shows how Roman law could leave basic services to the control of private citizens, and look what he did with it. While this may seem crazy today to allow fire protection to depend on financial negotiations, in Rome, it reflected a broader acceptance of personal wealth as a tool of influence. Crassus used the system to consolidate power and eventually became one of the most prominent figures of his age, joining Julius Caesar and Pompey in the First Triumvirate. Eventually, Augustus recognized the dangers of the system and established a public firefighting and police force in 6 CE. That reform ended the ability of individuals like Crassus to profit directly from fires. But for decades before, Roman law had effectively permitted a system where property owners had to bargain for the survival of their homes. Number 6. The Athenian law of ostracism. One really strange democratic law from ancient Athens was ostracism, a procedure that allowed citizens to vote a prominent individual into exile for 10 years without any formal charges or trial. This practice, introduced in the early 5th century BCE, was designed to prevent tyranny and protect the young democracy, but it often functioned in surprising and unpredictable ways. Once a year, the Athenian assembly could hold a vote on whether to conduct an ostracism. If approved, a second vote was held in which citizens scratched the name of the person they wanted in exile onto a shard of pottery called an ostracon. If at least 6,000 votes were cast, the man with the most votes was required to leave Athens within 10 days. He then had to remain in exile for 10 years, though he retained his property and could return afterwards without stigma. Ostracism was not technically a punishment for a crime, though. No charges had to be proven, and the individual didn't even have the opportunity to defend himself formally. Instead, it was a political safety valve. If someone was becoming too powerful, too ambitious, or simply too divisive, citizens could decide Athens would be better off without him for a while. Some of the most famous Athenians were ostracized, including Themistocles, the hero of the Battle of Salamis, and Aristides, nicknamed the Just. In some cases, political rivals used ostracism to sideline one another, and in others, citizens used it to express discontent with leaders who had fallen out of favor. From a modern perspective, ostracism seems kind of bizarre. Exiling someone without charges or a trial might seem deeply unjust, yet Athenians saw it as a way to preserve democracy from individuals who might threaten it. Rather than waiting for a tyrant to seize power, they preemptively neutralized anyone who seemed too dominant. Number 5. The law restricting women's wealth. During the Second Punic War, when Rome was under the extreme pressure from Hannibal's campaigns in Italy, the Roman state passed an unusual law aimed not at soldiers or enemies, but at women. This was the Lex Oppia, enacted in 215 BCE, which restricted women from displaying wealth in public. Specifically, it limited the amount of gold women could own, prohibited them from wearing brightly colored clothing, and even banned them from riding in carriages within the city, except during festivals. The law was introduced as an emergency measure. Rome was pouring immense resources into the war effort, and this restriction on luxury was meant to conserve wealth. It also reflected some Roman values of austerity, discipline, and sacrifice in service to the state. For Roman lawmakers, controlling women's appearance was part of demonstrating collective restraint. But what makes Lex Oppia especially notable is what happened after the war. Once Hannibal was defeated and Rome had regained its stability, women began protesting against the restrictions. By 195 BCE, they organized public demonstrations and demanded the law's repeal. Ancient sources like Livy describe women flooding the streets, blocking the paths of men and senators and insisting the law was outdated. The debate in the Senate was heated. The statesman Cato the Elder argued fiercely that repealing the law would lead to moral decline and excess, saying that women, if given too much freedom, would soon dominate men. Well, others countered that the war was over and there was no need to continue limiting women's personal choices. Eventually, the law was repealed, making it one of the earliest recorded examples of women successfully challenging legislation in Rome. Number 4. The ancient Indian law of caste restrictions. One rigid and unusual legal system of the ancient world developed in India around the caste system, or Varna. Early Hindu legal texts laid out detailed rules governing what people of each caste could and could not do. These laws were extraordinary in how far they went in regulating daily life, tying one's legal rights and obligations to your birth status. According to these laws, society was divided into 4 major varnas: priests, warriors, merchants and farmers, and servants and laborers. Each had distinct duties and restrictions. For example, the priests were prohibited from drinking alcohol or marrying outside their caste, while the servants and laborers were forbidden from reciting or even hearing the sacred text. If a servant overheard a recitation, some texts prescribed that molten lead should be poured into his ears, a punishment more symbolic than practical but written into the law nevertheless. The penalties for breaking these boundaries could be severe. Some were condemned and sometimes punished by banishment. Dietary laws were also enforced. Eating food prepared by someone of a lower caste could result in ritual pollution, requiring purification rituals or penalties. Even modes of dress, housing, and seating in public gatherings could be legally regulated according to caste. In a modern viewpoint, the rules seem extreme because they entrenched inequality into the law. Yet in the context of ancient India, the system was tied to religious beliefs about cosmic order. Each caste was seen to as having duties necessary for the stability of the universe, and strict enforcement was thought to preserve that harmony. Not every law was enforced literally, and there was often flexibility in practice. Still, though, similar texts show how ancient law could codify social division with shocking severity. Number 3. The Spartan law requiring boys to undergo the agoge. Sparta. It was one of the most militarized societies in the ancient world, and its laws reflected an obsession with discipline, endurance, and conformity. Among the most striking was the legal requirement that all male Spartan citizens undergo the agoge. This was a state-controlled education and training system that began at age 7 and lasted into early adulthood. According to the tradition, the law was established by Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver of Sparta. From the age of 7, boys were taken from their families and placed in communal barracks. There they lived under discipline, learning obedience, military tasks, and survival. They were intentionally underfed so they would be forced to steal food, but if they were caught, they were severely punished, not for stealing, but for being careless enough to get caught. The agoge also included brutal physical training. Boys were made to exercise constantly, endure cold without clothing, and withstand harsh beatings. One famous story describes boys whipped at the altar of the Artemis Orthia until they collapsed, a ritual meant to harden them and prove their endurance. The legal requirement, though, for all Spartan males to undergo the agoge was unusual in the ancient world. Most Greek city-states had forms of military training, but none institutionalized it so completely or began it at such a young age. This system, though, produced soldiers who were famously disciplined and feared across Greece, contributing to Sparta's dominance in the 5th century BCE, especially during the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. Though Sparta eventually declined, the legend of its laws and the agoge survived as symbols of extreme discipline and sacrifice. Number 2. The Qin Dynasty law standardizing everything. When Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BCE, he established not only the first centralized empire in Chinese history, but also one of the most sweeping legal reforms of the ancient world. His government, guided by the philosophy of legalism, imposed laws that standardized nearly every aspect of life, from weights and measures to the width of cart axles, the currency in circulation, and even the written script. One of the most famous laws required all carts in the empire to have axles of the same length. While this may sound trivial, it had a massive practical effect. Standardized axles ensured that ruts in roads were uniform, making transport across a huge empire more efficient. The Qin also legally enforced standardized written script, ensuring that officials across the empire could communicate effectively. This reform was critical for governance, since it reduced any misunderstandings and helped the emperor's orders reach the distant provinces. While these laws had practical benefits, they were enforced with the harshness characteristic of legalistic rule. Noncompliance could result in heavy punishment, including forced labor or death. Qin law also extended to cultural life too. Works of philosophy and history, not aligned with their principles, were banned in the infamous burning of the books. Many texts here were destroyed, while scholars who resisted were executed. Though the Qin dynasty itself was short-lived, it collapsed in 206 BCE, it had laws that had a lasting influence. Later dynasties kept many of these standardizations while discarding the harshest elements of legalism. What makes these laws stand out, though, as crazy is not that they lacked any purpose. In fact, they were highly practical, but that they revealed how far rulers would go to legislate the smallest details of life. Number 1. Hammurabi's Law. The Code of Hammurabi, carved into stone around 1750 BCE in Babylon, is one of the earliest and most detailed law codes to survive from the ancient world. Among its many regulations covering theft, contracts, family life, and property disputes is a striking law that relied not on evidence or testimony, but on a physical trial by ordeal. If a person was accused of a crime but the evidence was unclear, the code ordered that they be thrown into a river. Survival meant innocence, while drowning meant guilt. This law seems shocking to our modern eyes, but it reflected the religious worldview of the Babylonians. The rivers, especially the Euphrates, were believed to be under the authority of the gods. By casting someone into the river, judgment was left in divine hands. If the accused survived the ordeal, it was taken as proof that the gods had intervened on their behalf. If they drowned, it was seen as divine confirmation of their guilt. The specific text in Hammurabi's Code, Law Number 2, reads, If a man has charged another with laying a spell upon him, but he has not proved it, the accused shall go to the river. He shall leap into the river, and if the river has overcome him, his accuser shall take possession of his house. But if the river shows the man to be innocent and he comes out unhurt, the one who brought the charge shall be put to death, while he who leaped into the river shall take possession of the house of his accuser. Kinda convenient? This law shows how closely tied religion, justice, and daily life were in Babylon. And while it seems brutal, it had an element of fairness. False accusers could themselves face death if the accused survived. This law then acted as a deterrent against making frivolous or malicious accusations. It's also worth noting that similar ordeals appeared in other cultures. Even in medieval Europe, trial by water was used to test witches or criminals. Hammurabi's code shows how persistent the idea was that divine forces could directly judge human disputes. It does show the limits of ancient legal systems, which lacked any scientific evidence or professional police forces, and instead it just relied on symbolic acts that carried both religious authority and terrifying risk.